Imagine a universe where empires crumble into ash, where the ghosts of fallen warriors whisper in the void, and where one ship, a jagged beast of steel and vengeance, tears through the stars, fueled by a hatred that burns hotter than a dying sun. Soar, son of Craxus, a towering Verian warlord, has returned to the graveyard of his father's dreams, Kale 9, with one purpose: to resurrect the Dominion's glory by bathing its ruins in blood. But what happens when this unstoppable predator locks claws with his prey? A lone human widow, unarmed, unarmored, clutching nothing but a broken toy and a secret so deadly it could shatter galaxies. Is she the victim or the hunter? Buckle up, because this is no ordinary tale of revenge. This is a descent into fire, fury, and mysteries that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. If you're hooked on epic adventures like this, stories of vengeance, courage, and hidden truths, then you won't want to miss a single moment. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to join me on a new journey every single day. Trust me, you don't want to be the one left behind in the void. The Craxus's claw tore through the black expanse of space, its engines growling like a beast starved for prey. The warship was a jagged monstrosity, its hull forged from the bones of conquered worlds, its surface scarred by battles long faded into legend. Once, it had been the pride of the Verian Dominion, a symbol of their unyielding might, cutting through star systems with the precision of a predator's claw. Now, it was a relic, a ghost ship crewed by the desperate remnants of a fallen empire, driven by the will of one man, Soar, son of Craxus. Inside the command deck, Soar paced with restless fury, his clawed feet gouging deep scratches into the polished metal floor. His golden scales caught the flickering light of the overhead panels, shimmering like molten fire, and his crest, jagged and imposing, flared intermittently with bursts of heat that warped the air around him. At 8 feet tall, he towered over his underlings, a living monument to Verian superiority. His yellow eyes, slitted and unblinking, burned with a hatred that had simmered for 15 years, ever since the day his father fell on Kale 9, the day humanity and their wretched allies shattered the Dominion's reign. The command deck buzzed with the nervous energy of his crew, scrawny Veri with twitching neural implants, their scales dulled by malnutrition and fear. They darted between consoles, their clawed hands tapping at screens, monitoring the ship's descent towards target. Soar ignored them, his focus locked on the viewport ahead, where the void stretched endless and cold. Somewhere beyond that darkness lay Kale 9, the graveyard of his father's dreams, the planet where the Dominion's glory had been snuffed out. It was a wound in his soul, a festering scar that drove every breath he took, every thought that churned in his twisted mind. GRVX, he barked, his voice a guttural roar that echoed off the walls, sending a ripple of tension through the crew. Where are my enemies? I've waited long enough. This ship reeks of cowardice, and I tire of it. Find me a foe IZ who dares to stand against me. For the galaxy must know the Dominion rises again. GRVX, a wiry Verian with a perpetual hunch, scurried forward, clutching a holographic tablet that trembled slightly in his grasp. His neural implants, crude metal studs embedded along his skull, flickered faintly, betraying his anxiety. He was Source Chief Aide, a survivor of the war who'd clung to his master's shadow like a parasite, knowing his survival depended on obedience. "Yes, sir," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "We've been scanning KL9, the planet where the battle was lost. It's a wasteland now, barely inhabited, but we've identified 3 notable survivors." Soar stopped pacing, his head snapping toward GRVX with the speed of a striking serpent. His crest flared again, releasing a wave of heat that made the air shimmer and forced GRVX to take a step back. 3, Soar growled, his lipless mouth curling into a sneer. "Show me." GRVX tapped the tablet, and 3 holographic profiles flickered into existence, hovering in the space between them. The first was a Cronian mercenary, a hulking brute with obsidian skin that gleamed like polished stone, his 4 muscular arms capable of crushing Verian skulls with ease. The second was a Taurian gladiator, her lithe form coiled with menace, her plasma whips, tools of her trade, draped across her shoulders like dormant serpents. The third was a Cephoid warlord, its tentacled body a grotesque mass of shifting colors, its acidic secretions a terror that had drowned Dominion troops in agony during the war. Soar leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied each image. "Formidable," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "Not human, but strong. Worthy prey to star my campaign." He straightened, his crest extending to its full, intimidating height, casting jagged shadows across the deck. "I'll spill their blood on Kale 9's soil, where my father fell, and the Dominion's honor will blaze anew." "Which is closest?" GRVX hesitated, his implants flickering faster. "The Cronian, sir. He's holed up in the northern ruins, a fortress of scrap and stone. The scans show he's armed, heavy weaponry, likely scavenged from the battlefield." "Good," Soar said, his sneer widening into a grin that bared rows of serrated teeth. "A challenge. I'll get him first, then hunt the others. The galaxy will tremble at my name, and my father's spirit will rise from the ashes to see his son reclaim what was stolen." He turned back to the viewport, his claws flexing at his sides, each one a curved dagger honed to perfection. The Craxus's claw was descending now, its engines rumbling as it breached Kale 9's thin atmosphere, the hull shuddering under the strain. Soar felt the vibration in his bones, a thrill that stirred his blood. This was his moment, his destiny. The Dominion had been a colossus, a force that crushed worlds beneath its heel, and he was its last true heir. His father, Craxus, had been a titan among Veri, a warlord whose name once struck fear into the hearts of billions. But humanity, those soft, scheming vermin, had undone it all, turning strength into shame with their tricks and alliances. Soar's life since that day had been a single, burning purpose: vengeance. He remembered the stories his mother told him as a hatchling, huddled in the ruins of their homeworld after the fall. Craxus standing tall on Kale 9, his armor gleaming as he rallied the Dominion's legions against the tide of enemies. The humans, weak and weaponless on their own, had somehow turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse, their allies, Cronians, Taurians, Cephoids, closing the trap. Craxus had fought to the last, his roars shaking the earth, until a single figure, a shadow in the chaos, struck him down. No one knew who, no one saw the blow. But the result was undeniable. The Dominion collapsed, its worlds burned, and Soar's childhood became a crucible of rage. "I was born for this," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that only he could hear. "To take back what's mine, to make them pay." The deck grew quiet as the ship steadied, its landing thrusters kicking up clouds of dust visible through the viewport. Soar's mind churned with visions of triumph, his claws dripping with the blood of his father's enemies, their broken bodies piled at his feet, his lineage redeemed. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a scourge, a force to rewrite history. The Cronian would be the first, a stepping stone to greater kills. He imagined the mercenary's 4 arms flailing, his obsidian skin cracking under Soar's relentless assault, his screams echoing across the wastes. Then the Taurian, her whips snapping uselessly as he closed the distance, tearing her apart limb by limb. And the Cephoid, its tentacles writhing, its acid splashing harmlessly against his scales as he plunged his claws into its core. "Sir," GRVX ventured, breaking the silence. "We're nearly landed. The northern ruins are 20 clicks from the drop zone. Shall I prepare the assault team?" "No," Soar snapped, his gaze still fixed on the approaching planet. "This is mine alone. I don't share glory with weaklings. Ready my armor and weapons. I'll walk to him. Let him see death coming." GRVX nodded quickly, scurrying off to obey. Soar's armor was a masterpiece of Verian craft, its plates forged from a rare alloy that shimmered gold and black, each scale etched with runes of conquest. His weapons were simpler but no less deadly. A pair of curved talons, retractable and razor-sharp, built into his gauntlets, and a thermal lance. A handheld device that could unleash a focused blast of heat capable of melting steel. He rarely used the lance. It was too impersonal, too detached. He preferred the intimacy of claws, the feel of flesh tearing beneath his grip. The ship jolted as it touched down, the landing gear grinding against Kale 9's rocky surface. Soar felt the impact in his chest, a surge of adrenaline that made his secondary heart pound. He strode to the armory, his crew parting before him like prey before a predator. GRVX and another aide, KLYX, a mute Veri with a scarred face, were already there, polishing the armor to a mirror shine. Soar stood still as they fitted it over his massive frame, each plate clicking into place with a satisfying snap. The weight was familiar, grounding, a second skin that amplified his presence. KLYX handed him the thermal lance, and Soar clipped it to his belt, though he doubted he'd need it. "Perfect," he said, flexing his arms, feeling the power in every movement. He turned to the ramp controls, slamming a claw against the release panel. The hatch hissed open, revealing a landscape of desolation. Shattered towers leaning like broken teeth, dunes of ash stretching to the horizon, and a sky heavy with gray haze. The air hit him like a slap, dry, cold, laced with the faint tang of rust and decay. It was a fitting tomb for the Dominion's defeat, a place where ghosts lingered in every shadow. Soar stepped onto the ramp, his boots crunching against the sand, his crest flaring once more as he inhaled the scent of ruin. "KL9, he growled, his voice carrying into the wind. "You took my father. Now you'll give me my revenge." He began his march toward the northern ruins, his mind fixed on the Cronian, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Beyond a crumbled wall lay a makeshift cemetery, its graves marked by twisted metal and scattered ash. At its edge stood a figure, a human woman, her dark hair tangled, her jacket patched and worn. She knelt beside a mound, cradling a small girl who clutched a crude toy ship crafted from scrap. The child's face was soft, innocent, her eyes wide with the trust of youth. Soar froze, a spark igniting in his twisted mind. Humans, the species that had orchestrated his father's downfall, the cunning vermin who turned strength into shame. The Cronian could wait. This was personal. His blood surged, his claws flexing with anticipation. He waved GRVX back with a sharp gesture and approached, his shadow stretching long and dark over the desolate ground, swallowing the woman and child in its reach. The air grew thick with the scent of rust and ash as Soar loomed over them, his golden armor a stark contrast to the gray desolation around him. The woman didn't look up, her attention fixed on the child, who stirred slightly in her lap, murmuring something too faint to hear. The grave beside them was marked by a bent piece of metal, its surface scratched with a name he couldn't read and didn't care to. His crest flared again, releasing a controlled burst of heat that scorched the sand at his feet, sending a faint hiss into the silence. "Look at this," he growled, his voice a deep, guttural rasp that cut through the stillness like a blade. "A human sow and her runt, groveling in the dirt where my father died. Your kind did this, brought ruin to the Dominion, turned my birthright to ash. Stand, widow, and face me, or I'll crush you both where you kneel." The woman, Elara, finally lifted her head, her eyes shadowed with a grief so deep it seemed to swallow the light. They met his for a fleeting moment, gray and unreadable, before drifting back to the child. "We're not your fight," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying a quiet strength that grated against Soar's ears. "Leave us be." Her indifference was a spark to his fury. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the cemetery, sending a flock of scavenger birds scattering from a nearby wreck. "Not my fight," he roared, stepping closer, his boots kicking up clouds of ash that dusted the grave mound. "Your species murdered my legacy. I am Soar, son of Craxus, heir to the Dominion's might, and I'll have your blood as payment for what you've done." He slammed a claw into the ground, the impact cracking the brittle earth, his heat washing over them in a wave that made the child. Lila flinch, her small hands tightening around the toy ship. Elara's fingers brushed the ship as if to shield it, her grip on Lila steadying the girl against her side. "Go away," she said, her tone flat, almost bored. "We're just trying to live." "Lie." Soar's sneer widened, baring rows of serrated teeth as he towered over them. "You don't deserve to breathe the air of this place. My father stood here, a titan among warriors, leading the Dominion to glory, and your kind cut him down with tricks and cowardice. You think you can hide behind that whelp and escape justice?" He reached down, snatching a rusted blade from a nearby grave, a relic of some forgotten soldier, and hurled it at her feet. It landed with a dull clang, kicking up a puff of dust, but Elara didn't move, didn't even glance at it. Her hands remained steady, stroking Lila's hair as the girl buried her face deeper into her mother's side, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Soar's heat surged, his crest flaring to its full height, casting jagged shadows across the cemetery. "Coward!" he bellowed, slashing the air with his claws, the motion so swift it whistled through the wind. "Stand and face me, or I'll make you beg for mercy you'll never get." He lunged forward, stopping just short of them, his claws hovering inches from Elara's face. The air shimmered with his heat, the sand beneath his feet turning glassy, but she didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She simply sat there, her gaze drifting past him as if he were nothing more than a nuisance, a fly buzzing too close to be worth swatting. The dismissal fueled his rage like oil on a fire. He circled them now, a predator sizing up prey, his mind racing with ways to break her. He'd come to Kale, 9 for glory, for a worthy foe to mark his ascent, but this was personal. Humans were the architects of his shame, the schemers who'd undone his father's empire with their alliances and deceit. This woman, this frail, grieving thing, was a symbol of their arrogance, their refusal to bow. He'd make her fight, make her bleed, and through her, he'd send a message to the galaxy. The Dominion was not dead. His father's death would not be in vain. He'd carve his vengeance into her flesh, a tribute to Craxus's memory, a spark to reignite the Verian flame. "You think silence will save you?" he snarled, kicking the grave mound again, this time hard enough to scatter the ash across her lap. Lila whimpered louder, her small body trembling, and Soar's eyes narrowed, locking onto the child. A cruel grin split his face, a gleam of sadistic inspiration flickering in his yellow gaze. He'd found his leverage. "Fine," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing purr, thick with malice. "If you won't fight, maybe she will." He moved before Elara could react, his claw snatching the toy ship from Lila's hands with brutal speed. The girl screamed, a piercing wail that tore through the desolation, her small arms reaching helplessly as Soar held the scrap metal creation aloft. "What's this?" he mocked, turning in his grip, his claws scraping its surface with deliberate slowness. "A trinket from your dead sire? A little ship for a little runt. Pathetic." He tightened his fist, the metal buckling under his strength, creaking and groaning as it fought to hold its shape. Lila's cry turned to a sob, her voice breaking as she pleaded, "No, give it back. It's Papa's." Soar's grin widened, his eyes glinting with vicious delight. "Papa's, is it? Your Papa's dead, little one. Dead because of your kind's treachery." He crushed the toy fully now, the metal splintering into jagged shards that rained down onto the sand, "is all he's worth now." He tossed the wreckage aside, the remnants clattering against a grave marker with a hollow, mocking sound. Lila's sobs grew louder, her hands clutching at the air where her treasure had been, her small frame shaking with grief. "Stop it!" Elara's voice cut through the noise, sharp and cold, the first crack in her calm facade. She rose to her feet in one fluid motion, pulling Lila behind her, her body a shield between the child and the monster before them. Her eyes locked on his source, no longer distant, but blazing with a fury that seemed to shift the air around her, a storm brewing in their gray depths. "You've done enough," she said, her voice a blade unsheathed, each word laced with a quiet menace that made the wind itself seem to still. "Leave her out of this." Soar stepped closer, his heat washing over them in waves, his claws flexing as if eager to strike. "Enough?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Not until I've broken you, human. Tomorrow, at dawn, you'll face me in the arena, or I'll take her instead." He pointed a claw at Lila, his grin stretching wider as the girl shrank back, her sobs muffled against Elara's leg. "Imagine her screams when I tear her apart piece by piece. Picture it, her little hands clawing at me, her voice begging for you to save her. Will you fight then, widow? Or will you watch her die, like the coward you are?" The air grew heavy, the silence between them thick with tension. Lila's cries softened to whimpers, her small hands clutching Elara's jacket, her face buried in the fabric as if it could shield her from the nightmare standing before them. Soar watched, his chest heaving with anticipation, waiting for the fear, the pleading he craved. He wanted her to crumble, to fall to her knees and beg, to give him the satisfaction of her submission before he forced her into the fight. But when Elara spoke, her voice was steel, cold and unyielding, cutting through his expectations like a knife through flesh. "Dawn," she said, her gaze never leaving his, her eyes burning with a resolve that sent an unbidden chill up his spine. "You'll have your fight. Leave her alone." Soar laughed, a triumphant bellow that shook the air, his crest flaring in victory as he threw his head back. "Good. I'll enjoy breaking you, human. Your blood will stain this ground, a tribute to my father's memory, a sign that the Dominion lives again." He turned away, striding back toward his aides, his armor clanking with each step, his mind already painting the scene of her defeat. Her body broken at his feet, her child's cries silenced, the galaxy watching as he reclaimed his birthright. But that chill lingered, a whisper in the dark corners of his thoughts, a splinter of doubt he couldn't name. Her eyes, those gray, burning eyes, hadn't wavered, hadn't shown a flicker of fear. There was something in her calm, her coldness, that felt wrong, like a trap he'd stumbled into blind. He reached GRVX, who stood waiting with the other aides, their faces pale and tense. "Prepare the arena," Soar snapped, his voice sharp with command. "Dawn tomorrow, in the city's heart. I want every survivor there to witness her end. Bring the drones. Let the galaxy see what happens to those who defy me." Soar didn't look back as he marched toward the Craxus's claw, his rage simmering beneath a veneer of triumph. He'd forced her hand, provoked her into the fight he wanted. She was his now, a human to slaughter, a symbol to destroy. Yet that chill refused to fade, a nagging sensation that he'd awakened something he didn't understand. He buried it deep, drowning it in visions of her blood on his claws, her child's screams fading into silence. Tomorrow, he'd have his victory. Tomorrow, Kale, 9 would echo with his name. Behind him, Elara knelt again, pulling Lila into her arms, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a fury she'd sworn to bury. She brushed the ash from the girl's face, whispering, "It's okay, love. I'll make it right." Her fingers brushed the scattered shards of the toy ship, the last gift from her husband, now a ruin like everything else on this planet. She gathered them gently, tucking them into her pocket, a silent vow forming in her chest. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon where Soar had vanished, a storm brewing in their depths, a promise of retribution that the winds of Kale, 9 couldn't drown. She'd given him what he wanted, a fight. But it wouldn't be the victory he expected. GRVX nodded quickly, his implants flickering nervously under the weight of Soar's glare. "Yes, sir. It'll be done." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear that clung to him like a second skin. But he turned away, barking orders to the other aides as they scrambled to obey. Soar didn't linger to watch them scatter. He marched toward the Craxus's claw, his armor clanking with each heavy step, the sound a harsh counterpoint to the wind's mournful howl. His mind churned with visions of triumph, Elara's blood pooling in the sand, her child's cries fading into silence, the galaxy bowing before the reborn might of the Dominion. He'd forced her hand, bent her to his will, and tomorrow at dawn, he'd crush her beneath his claws. Yet that chill, that unbidden shiver that had crept up his spine when she'd spoken, Dawn, you'll have your fight, refused to fade. It gnawed at him, a splinter of doubt he buried beneath his rage, dismissing it as weakness unworthy of a Verian warrior. The ramp of the ship hissed as he ascended, the hatch sealing behind him with a dull clang that echoed through the command deck. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint glow of consoles and the pulsing red of emergency lights, a stark contrast to the golden fire of his armor. His crew parted before him, their eyes averted, their scales dulled by years of defeat. Soar ignored them, his focus narrowing to a single point, the human woman. She was nothing, he told himself, a grieving widow, a fragile thing clinging to a child in a world that had no use for either. But her eyes, those gray, burning eyes, haunted him, a flicker of something he couldn't name. He snarled, slamming a claw against a bulkhead, the metal denting under the blow. She's mine, he growled to no one, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the deck. Tomorrow she dies. He strode to the armory, his sanctuary aboard this decaying relic, where his weapons and armor waited like loyal hounds. GRVX followed at a cautious distance, clutching his holographic tablet, his implants still flickering with nervous energy. Sir, he ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. The arena will be ready by midnight. We've marked a circle in the city's heart, Verian runes, as you commanded. The survivors will be there, and the drones are charging now. The feed will reach the outer systems by dawn. Soar nodded curtly, running a claw along the edge of his thermal lance, its sleek surface cool against his heat. Good. I want no mistakes. This isn't just a fight, it's a declaration. The galaxy will see what happens to those who defy me. He turned to GRVX, his yellow eyes narrowing. But there's something about her, something off. She didn't beg, didn't flinch. I want to know who she is. Find me everything. Her name, her past, anything the scans can pull from this wretched rock. I'll not be blindsided by a human. GRVX swallowed hard, his claws tightening around the tablet. Yes, sir. The records from Kale, 9 are fragmented. War damage, data corruption. But I'll dig into the survivor logs, cross-reference what's left of the human archives. It'll take time. Make it fast, Soar snapped, his crest flaring briefly, sending a wave of heat that made GRVX flinch. I want it before dawn. She's hiding something. I can feel it. Give me answers, or I'll carve them from your hide instead. GRVX scurried off, disappearing into the ship's labyrinth of corridors, leaving Soar alone with his thoughts. He paced the armory, his claws clicking against the floor, his mind replaying the encounter. She'd been so calm, too calm, her voice steady even as he'd crushed the child's toy, her gaze unflinching as he'd threatened her daughter's life. Most prey would have crumbled, would have pleaded or fled, but she'd stood there, a wall of quiet defiance, and that final word, dawn, had carried a weight he couldn't shake. It wasn't fear, wasn't desperation. It was a promise, and it unsettled him in a way no enemy ever had. He stopped before a cracked mirror bolted to the wall, staring at his reflection. A warrior born of fire and blood, his scales etched with the scars of a dozen duels, his crest a crown of jagged menace. He was Soar, son of Craxus, the last true heir of the Dominion, a force no human could hope to match. Yet that woman's face lingered in his mind, her gray eyes cutting through his certainty like a blade through flesh. You're nothing, he muttered to the mirror, his breath fogging the glass. A widow with a whelp. I'll break you, and your kind will remember why they feared us. Hours passed, the ship humming with the low drone of its systems as night deepened over KL9. Soar busied himself with preparations, sharpening his talons, calibrating the thermal lance, running through combat forms in the armory's cramped space. Each move was precise, a dance of death honed over years of training, his body a weapon forged in the crucible of his father's legacy. He imagined her falling, her frail form crumpling under his strikes, her blood staining the sand. Her child screams a symphony to his triumph. It fueled him, stoked the fire in his chest, but that splinter of doubt remained, a cold thread woven into his rage. GRVX returned as the first hints of dawn crept through the viewport, his scales paler than usual, his implants flickering erratically. He clutched the tablet like a shield, his voice quavering as he approached. "Sir, I've found something. It's not much. The human records are a mess, war-torn and scattered. She's not in the refugee lists, no name, no origin. But I pulled this from a deep archive, a fragment buried in an old military database." Soar snatched the tablet, his claws scraping its edges as he scanned the glowing text. A single line flickered into view, stark and incomplete. Subject: Reaper, status: retired, location unknown. Note: 327 confirmed kills, KL, 9 deployment. The entry cut off abruptly, the rest lost to corruption, leaving only those cryptic words hanging in the air. "Reaper," Soar muttered, his crest flaring as he read it again, the number searing into his mind. 327. His secondary heart thudded faster, a rare flicker of unease tightening his chest. "What's this nonsense?" GRVX shrank back, his voice barely a whisper. "It's all we have, sir. A codename, maybe a myth, some say. The number, it's high. Too high for a civilian. The KL, 9 deployment matches the final battle, where your father fell." Soar's laugh was hollow, a forced bark that didn't reach his eyes. 327 kills? A human myth to scare children. She's no warrior, just a mother with a death wish. This changes nothing. He hurled the tablet back at GRVX, who fumbled to catch it, the device clattering against his chest. "Prepare the arena. I'll get her at dawn, Reaper or not." But GRVX hesitated, his implants dimming as he clutched the tablet tighter. "Sir, 327 kills. That's more than most of our commanders claimed in the war. What if?" "Silence!" Soar roared, his claws slashing through the air, stopping inches from GRVX's throat. The aide froze, his breath hitching as Soar's heat washed over him. "She's weak, and I'll prove it. Speak again, and I'll feed you to the drones. Go!" GRVX fled, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, leaving Soar alone once more. He turned back to the mirror, his reflection distorted by the cracks, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and something darker, doubt. "Reaper." The word echoed in his skull, a whisper he couldn't silence. 327 kills. KL9. The numbers aligned too neatly, too perfectly with the day his father died, the day the Dominion fell. He shook his head, snarling at his own weakness. She was nothing, a human, soft and frail, no match for a Verian warrior born of fire and blood. Yet as he stared into the mirror, he saw not just himself but her, those gray eyes, that cold promise, lurking behind his reflection like a specter. Dawn broke over Kale. 9. A weak light filtering through the haze, casting long shadows across the ruined city. Soar emerged from the Craxus's claw, his armor polished to a blinding sheen, his thermal lance clipped to his belt, his talons gleaming with fresh sharpness. The arena awaited, a circle of sand ringed by Verian runes, carved deep into the ground by his aides during the night. Survivors had been herded to its edges, their faces gaunt and fearful, forced to bear witness by the threat of Verian blades. Drones hummed overhead, their lenses glinting as they prepared to broadcast his victory to the galaxy. Soar stepped into the circle, his crest flaring as he raised his claws, his voice booming across the silence. "Behold, I am Soar, son of Craxus, here to reclaim the Dominion's honor. This human's blood will mark our rise, a warning to all who defy me." The crowd flinched as one, their murmurs swallowed by the wind, but Soar's gaze was fixed on the horizon, waiting for her. She came then, a lone figure emerging from the shadows of a wrecked tower, her steps slow and deliberate. Elara wore no armor, no weapons, only her tattered jacket and pants, her feet bare against the sand. Her dark hair fell over her face, hiding those gray eyes, but her presence carried a weight that silenced the whispers. Behind her, Lila sat at the edge of the circle, guarded by an old scavenger woman, clutching the broken remnants of the toy ship, her small face streaked with tears but resolute. Elara knelt briefly beside her, brushing a hand over the girl's cheek. "Stay here, love," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. "It'll be over soon." Soar sneered, his claws flexing as she stepped into the ring. "No arme? No blade? You insult me, widow." She straightened, her eyes meeting his at last, gray and unyielding, a storm contained in their depths. "I don't need them," she said simply, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Let's end this." The word Reaper flashed in Soar's mind, unbidden, and that chill returned, sharper now, a blade pressed against his spine. He shook it off, his crest flaring as he roared, "Then die." He charged, claws slashing, heat blasting from his core, determined to bury his doubt in her blood. But as she moved, fast, fluid, a shadow slipping through his grasp, he felt the first true pang of regret, a realization that the trap he'd sensed was real, and he'd walked right into it. Soar charged, his claws slashing through the air with a speed that split the wind, his crest blazing with a heat that turned the sand beneath his feet into molten glass. The arena trembled under his roar, a primal bellow that shook the survivors huddled at its edges and sent the drones buzzing higher, their lenses locked on the spectacle. He was a storm of gold and fire, a Verian warrior in his prime, driven by rage and the unshakable belief that this human, this frail, unarmed widow, would fall like so many before her. His first strike aimed for her throat, a killing blow meant to end it in an instant, to paint the sand with her blood and silence that nagging doubt once and for all. But Elara moved, fast, fluid, a shadow slipping through his grasp, and his claws met only air, the force of his swing throwing him off balance for a fleeting second. He stumbled, his heat flaring hotter as he spun to face her, his yellow eyes narrowing with fury. She stood a few paces away, her stance loose, her bare feet planted in the sand, her gray eyes locked on him with an intensity that pierced through his rage. There was no fear in her gaze, no hesitation, only a cold, unyielding calm that made his secondary heart thud faster, a rhythm of unease he couldn't suppress. "Fight! Damn you!" he screamed, his voice cracking the air as he lunged again, his talons slashing in a wide arc, a blur of gold and death aimed at her chest. She ducked low, her body bending with a grace that belied her ragged appearance, and rolled to the side, coming up behind him as his claws gouged deep furrows into the sand. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the survivors, their eyes wide with something Soar couldn't place. Fear, yes, but also a flicker of hope. He whirled, his crest pulsing with heat, and unleashed a thermal surge, a blast of searing energy from his core that scorched the air and turned the sand into a shimmering sheet of glass. The wave roared toward her, a wall of death that had melted steel and flesh alike in battles past. But Elara dove behind a jagged piece of wreckage at the arena's edge, a rusted shard of the starship's hull. Her movements precise, almost effortless. The heat slammed into the metal, warping it with a groan, but she emerged unscathed, her jacket singed at the edges, her eyes still fixed on him. "You're fast," he snarled, his voice thick with venom as he stalked forward, his claws flexing. "But speed won't save you. I'll tear you apart." He charged again, faster now, his rage boiling over, his talons slashing in a relentless flurry. High, low, left, right, a storm of strikes meant to overwhelm her, to leave no escape. She danced through them, her body weaving between each blow with a precision that bordered on inhuman, her bare feet shifting the sand in subtle patterns, her hands empty but poised like weapons waiting to strike. One claw grazed her arm, a shallow cut that drew a thin line of blood, but she didn't falter, didn't cry out. Instead, she twisted away, her gray eyes flashing with something new, anger, sharp and lethal, a storm breaking through her calm. Soar roared, his heat surging as he pressed the attack, his mind a whirlwind of fury and confusion. She was no warrior. She couldn't be. She was a widow, a mother, a human weakling clinging to a child in a world that had no mercy for either. Yet every move she made mocked him, every dodge a slap to his pride, every glance a reminder of that word, Reaper, that had burned into his thoughts since GRVX's discovery. 327 kills. KO 9. The numbers clawed at him, a doubt he couldn't bury, and as he swung again, his claws aiming to rip her in half, she spoke, her voice cutting through his rage like a blade through silence. "I've faced worse than you," she said, her tone low and steady, each word a hammer striking his certainty. "Hundreds. For peace. For her." She nodded toward Lila, the small girl at the arena's edge, clutching the broken toy ship, her tear-streaked face watching with a trust that made Soar's stomach twist. "You shouldn't have touched her." The words hit him like a blow, and for a moment he faltered, his claws hesitating mid-strike. Reaper. The code name flashed in his mind, unbidden, and with it came the fragment of truth he dismissed as myth. 327 confirmed kills. KO 9 deployment. His crest flared erratically, his heat faltering as he stared at her, the frail widow transforming before his eyes into something else, something he hadn't prepared for. He gasped, his voice breaking, but before he could finish, she struck. Elara lunged, her empty hands snatching a jagged shard of metal from the sand, a piece of the wreckage she'd used as a shield, its edge rough but deadly. She drove it into his side, targeting a gap between his armor scales with surgical precision, the force of her blow sinking it deep into his flesh. Soar howled, a sound of pain and fury that shook the arena, blood seeping from the wound as he staggered back, his claws slashing wildly to keep her at bay. She ducked under the swing, her movements a blur, and struck again, the shard piercing another weak point near his thigh, tearing through muscle and scale. His leg buckled, his heat dimming as pain lanced through him, but he swung again, desperation fueling his rage. "Die!" he screamed, his voice raw, his claws raking the air as he lunged forward, his full weight behind the blow. She sidestepped, the sand shifting under her feet, and drove the shard upward, aiming for the soft flesh beneath his throat where his scales were thinnest. The metal bit deep, blood spraying across her face, and Soar choked, his roar turning to a gurgle as he collapsed to his knees, his claws scrabbling at the wound. His heat faded, his crest drooping, his golden armor dulled by dust and blood. He stared up at her, his yellow eyes wide with shock and something else, fear, raw and unfiltered, a terror he'd never known. "You're the Reaper," he rasped, blood bubbling at his lips, his voice a broken whisper. "The one who—" "No," she said, her voice steel, her gray eyes cold as she stood over him, the shard dripping in her hand. "I'm just her mother now, but you woke something you can't stop." She stepped back, dropping the weapon into the sand, her chest heaving not with exhaustion, but with a fury that had burned through her restraint. The crowd was silent, the drones whirring overhead, capturing every second of his defeat, broadcasting it to the galaxy he'd sworn to conquer. Soar's vision blurred, his strength draining as he slumped forward, his claws digging into the sand to hold himself up. He'd come to KO 9 for glory, for vengeance, to reclaim his father's honor and prove the Dominion's might. He'd seen her as prey, a weakling to crush, but now he saw the truth, too late, too cruelly clear. She wasn't just a widow. She was a force, a phantom of the war he'd never truly understood, a killer who'd buried her past until he'd forced it to rise. Regret clawed at him, a bitter taste beneath the blood, but it was drowned by the pain, the humiliation, the realization that he'd lost everything in this moment. Elara turned away, her back to him as she walked toward Lila, who ran to her with a sob, throwing her small arms around her mother's waist. Elara knelt, pulling the girl close, her blood-streaked hands gentle as she brushed Lila's tears away. It's done, she whispered, her voice softening, the storm in her eyes fading to a quiet resolve. You're safe now. The survivors watched in stunned silence, their whispers growing into a murmur that spread like wildfire. She beat him. The widow beat him. The drones hovered, their feeds cutting off as source aides rushed into the arena, dragging his broken form from the sand. GRVX's face was ashen, his implants dim as he barked orders, pulling Soar back to the Craxus's claw. The Verian lived, barely, his breath shallow, his pride shattered, a shadow of the tyrant who descended on Kale, 9 with dreams of conquest. Elara didn't look back. She lifted Lila into her arms, the broken toy ship clutched between them, and walked away from the arena, her bare feet leaving faint prints in the sand. The wind picked up, scattering the blood and ash, erasing the marks of the fight as if it had never happened. But the survivors remembered, and the galaxy would too. A human widow, a mother, had felled a Verian monster not with weapons or armor, but with a strength born of love and a past she'd tried to forget. That night, she sat by a small fire in the ruins, Lila curled against her side, the toy shards laid out before them. I promised your father no more fighting, she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears as she traced the jagged edges. But I'd burn this world to ash for you. She pulled Lila closer, her gray eyes lifting to the stars, where her husband's memory lingered, a silent witness to her vow. Lila stirred, her small hand touching Elara's face. "You're my shield, Mama," she whispered, her voice soft but sure. Elara smiled, a rare, fragile thing, and kissed her daughter's forehead. "And you're my heart." The fire crackled, its light dancing across their faces, a beacon in the dark of KL9. She'd fought, she'd killed, and she'd won. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but for the girl in her arms. And as the wind carried the ashes away, Elara made a new promise, unspoken but ironclad. No one would harm her daughter again.